what you saw in, I would say, the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s is you had a sort of culture of looking up, of young Christian people looking up to prominent figures who were creators of Christian media. And it was almost like we were getting our morals, and we were getting our getting our worldview from this media instead of from our parents trying to teach us the Bible or whatever. And that's just normal because kids are always rebellious to a certain degree. Even kids that grow up in good Christian homes.
You mean especially in good Christian homes?
Yes. So it kind of produced an interesting effect. You have these figures exercise so much influence over young believers, and then come to find out that many of them may not have even been true believers in the first place. It's very interesting.
Yeah, there's a ton of examples like that where artists come out later on and they renounce the gospel, or they convert to something else, or they claim they're agnostic or atheist.
Yeah, I want to go over a couple examples.
What are some examples of those?
The biggest ones I feel like, so you have, first example is the author. I can't remember his name, but the guy who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye. So that book had a huge influence on purity culture within evangelical circles.
Joshua Harris?
Yes. And it profoundly shaped the lives of many, many young people. And its influence, I would say, lasts to this day. I was just reading on, I never grew up in an environment that was purity obsessed, but a lot of young believers of my generation did. And it still affects them, because I was reading, scrolling through Facebook, and I saw a post from someone who I grew up with, and who grew up evangelical just like I did. And she was talking about going back to church, and I don't know how long she stopped going to church or whatever, but I don't know if this post was talking about recent events or if it was kind of looking back to something. But she talked about going back to church as an adult, and then being married and finding that the men in her church were uncomfortable being around her if her husband left the room.
Interesting.
Like they would, they'd be like, in a social setting talking, and then the husband leaves the room for a second. And so I'm presuming she's having a conversation with some other dude who is also a married man himself. And maybe his wife's not in the room right now. Maybe she was somewhere else. But suddenly these two people are in the room with each other, and they're not married to each other. And they're alone together,
Yeah, in quotes, yeah.
And like she was talking about this other man in the room, like being looking very uncomfortable, like he's would like I guess this happened in more than one situation.
Mhm.
Like in one situation, this guy she was talking to, having a conversation with, trying to get to know, kind of a thing, kind of like left the room real fast after her husband stepped out. And then another time she was talking about how he basically, the other guy she was talking to, like her husband stepped out of the room again, and this other guy she was talking to, having a conversation with, like kind of just like, wouldn't look at her, as like basically like pretended she didn't exist until her husband came back into the room.
Huh.
And it's like, so I didn't really grow up in like that serious amount of purity culture, but other people did. And, it's had interesting effects on people who grew up as evangelicals in this, in my generation. And so Joshua Harris comes out and he says he doesn't believe in God anymore. And, well, maybe he doesn't disbelieve in God, but he doesn't believe in the God of the Bible anymore. And from the way he talks about his deconversion, so to speak, it doesn't sound like, it kind of sounds like, I don't want to, it's not my place to judge.
Yeah.
So I don't know, but it kind of sounds like he never truly knew Jesus to begin with.
Ooh, really? From what it sounds like.
From what it sounds like. And, and now all of a sudden too, he's like putting out posts on social media where he's like apologizing to the gays about how they've been treated by the church and all that. He's like literally just like abandoned the pretense of evangelicalism or conservatism at all, and is completely just like totally secular, has basically become a leftist, just like Phil Vischer did.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Your example of your friend and the guy being uncomfortable in the room. I mean, I was definitely like exposed to like purity culture, but I never read that book, never even heard of it until like later teens, maybe adulthood. Like it never really crossed my path. I'm sure my siblings definitely read it or something like that, but it never really came into my view. But that whole situation sounds like it's confusing. Sometimes I've noticed this, like just in retrospective over my life, sometimes purity can blend in with insecure behavior really well. And I think personally, from just observing that kind of situation, it's insecurity taking its place of maturity. And yes, resisting temptation is important, but we're adults. Like, come on. And you're both married to other people. Like, it's just, to me, sounds completely ridiculous. And I just, I just am not. It's just weird,
It is ridiculous.
But that being a spawn of that kind of culture, which I'm familiar with as well, in a sense. But like, just look at the, I don't know, look at the results of that, and it's just, that's the result of the purity culture. And there's nothing wrong with purity. In fact, I encourage purity among, all folks. I mean, if it is too much of a temptation, remove yourself from the situation. I totally understand that. But in that kind of scenario, it just reminds me of just somebody being kind of just insecure and wants to obey rules and just, I'm not going to do that because,
yeah.
I'm scared of her husband or
no,
for whatever reason,
What I think in that situation, what I think is the main driver of that is fear.
Yes.
They've been instilled with this fear that if you don't, that if you are alone in a room with a woman you're not married to for just slightly too long, then like you're just going to be overcome with lust, and all sorts of bad things are going to happen. And
Yeah.
obviously if you're a married person, um there's certain boundaries that you put in place.
Absolutely.
There's certain levels of closeness and intimacy
Hmm.
that you have with your wife that you don't have with the women who are not your wife.
Yeah.
But one thing that I think the sort of overboard purity culture
Mm.
that I've seen, I never experienced it personally because, like I said, I didn't grow up in excessive purity culture, but I know people who have,
Mm.
and that I think that's kind of what that produces
Mm.
is like a fear of temptation, to where you have to set your boundaries, um at a place uh that seems a little ridiculous in order to feel safe from temptation.
Yeah. I could be totally wrong in this, what I'm about to say, but it's just from complete observation and from what people have told me as well and seeing what they have to say. It's kind of like you're engaged to somebody for so friggin' long and you finally get married that once you do be intimate with that person, it feels wrong because of the overbearing purity culture, even though you have every right to do what you want with each other because you're married. So whatever. But that also is a product of that. It kind of reminds me of the product of over sexualizing and our culture in general and the effect of porn, especially because that leaves a huge amount of shame on people. That is very much fear inducing and insecurity inducing to the individual as well. And it's funny because from what I'm not married, but from what I've talked with other people folks who are married, that's an interesting thing to take away from it. That I'm not saying those have the same results, over purity or not purity at all, but it's interesting how fear can be in both of those things,
Yeah.
even with good intentions of making a book called I Kiss Dating Goodbye. Was it even made in good intentions? It makes you question everything after the guy like came out and just rescinded everything. It reminds me of the chick who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and they made the movie with Julia Roberts. She, as they were making the movie, I believe she came out and she stated like she seeks God and she's not necessarily Christian, but she did like say a lot of things that people say, "Oh my God, is she a Christian? That rescinds Eat, Pray, Love," because it's all about being new age and finding yourself spiritually, but without God in general. But the fact that she's seeking God is interesting, but it just rescinds every work she's done before that in terms of Eat, Pray, Love. um, and also like Phil Vischer's an interesting topic too. Like it might just be, oh, maybe he's just looking for relevancy. I'm kind of coping at this moment because, he's a creator of VeggieTales and I kind of admire him in that way, but nobody's perfect. And that's the thing. That's why we shouldn't have people on a pedestal like that. So I don't know. That's just what I was thinking as you were regaling me with the topic of purity culture, but it's funny. Again, it's interesting how fear is a big aspect of both of those.
Yeah, and I mean, fear is kind of the original driver for this, I think, anyway, because as far as I can tell...
Well, also, it's the big driver for the satanic panic thing.
Yeah.
It was totally fear-based.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. You have starting really to take off in the 80s, I would say, is you had this fear among evangelicals about what was taking place in culture, and so their response to sort of pull away and create their own evangelical sort of subculture, I think was a fear response, because it's not like, if the culture shifts, we need to do everything that they're doing. We need to look like the world. Far from it. We should absolutely look different than the world. But our response to culture doesn't have to be
Hmm.
rooted in fear of engaging with the culture.
Yes.